Hello, everybody. I am Sarthak Kaul, and this is True Calling. Today, we have a great guest with us. His name's Justin Dobson. Justin is the director of business development at DoorDash. He joined DoorDash back in 2017 when it was a 200-person, 300-person startup, trying to figure out product market fit, and has stayed through seeing it through an IPO, and now almost up to 20,000 employees and millions of customers. Justin, thank you so much for doing this.
Hey, thank you for having me, Sarthak.
Of course. I, of course, want to talk to you about the journey scaling DoorDash, but I am very interested in embarking together, pun fully intended, on your journey as a previous founder for a travel company in Canada called Embark Together. And before that, in Seth Godin's altMBA program, how your experience was there. And we're going to take it back to your journey from Canada, now living in Austin. So let's begin.
Love it.
First thing that I wanted to ask you, so I reached out to a friend of yours. His name's Tim Knight. And I asked him, essentially, do you have a favorite story of Justin that sort of shows his qualities and values from back when you were together at the altMBA? And he said, one thing that has always stood out to me is Justin's ability to be a sounding board. I was in the same cohort as him in the altMBA program, and he was always available to listen to a crazy idea and then offer additional crazy ideas or offer critiques to make the crazy idea viable in the real world. Since the altMBA, he has kept that open mind and continues to push ideas into reality. Another thing that I've enjoyed since we left altMBA is seeing the passion he has for his family. Watching him grow and his family grow has been a treasure. Both his acting as a sounding board and his passion for his family stem from his ability to be present wherever he is. He gives his focus and attention and genuinely listens and cares. So, my question for you is, have you developed this skill to be present very intently or intentionally? Or is that something that you always sort of had and you were fine just being the sounding board for someone?
One, it's great to hear that you met Tim, who was like so much fun to work with in the altMBA. So that's neat. So shout out to Tim. And so that I think about that feedback as one being like very like kind, and like I'm grateful for Tim sharing that. And if I think back to like my upbringing and what I felt was important going through like the high school years into university was like there's lots of ways to compete in this world, right? And if you think about the experience being in high school and then in university, like obviously like academically you can compete. But there's other ways to like also be relevant and like learn, I guess, like skills for yourself, but also like learn more about the world around you. So for me, I think what I felt was a way to help differentiate if I was looking beyond just say like academics, and like what I knew early in life, which in a lot of cases you don't know much, right? You want to learn. I think adopting a mindset of like, how can I ask good questions? How can I learn from others' experience in order to kind of form my own opinions, can be really helpful. And so for me, I would say like in my later high school years and into college, it was always important for me to think about like, how could I best kind of like leverage the experiences of others in order to learn and experience the world in kind of like my own way, with like on the backs of like the things that other people have learned. So when I think about being a sounding board, oftentimes like those are my hopes, is that I can learn or contribute obviously as well in ways that can like enrich my life and give me an insight that maybe I didn't have previously.
Yeah, I mean, whenever we have hung out, it's been very obvious that you're very curious as a person, And that's just an amazing quality, and we need more of that in this world. But the other thing, coming back to this question kind of towards you, is like, who is your sounding board?
Good question. Good, because I don't know if I think about it as intentionally now as I might have when I was younger. I use, sounding boards in kind of like all facets of life, I would say. So I think about my wife and our relationship, and how much, I guess, like better I am in kind of like all facets of my life by having her as somebody who can be a sounding board and point me into the direction of like, hey, am I thinking about this the right way? Or have you thought about that? Professionally, I have like friends at work that I've cultivated relationships with, where finding those colleagues where you really feel like you can kind of speak open and honestly and without kind of the fear of judgment, those people tend to be the ones that I look to lean on as sounding boards. And then I try to reflect that back, I would say, as well, where my goal for my interactions with others, especially professionally, is like to be somebody where people feel like I'm very open and welcoming to like sounding board ideas off of, bounce things off of. So those are a couple of examples. And then now through, how you and I have met through grad school, I would say like that's another exciting group of people, right? That are all like super curious, super high achieving, where you can bounce things off one another.
Yeah. And, going back to your comment there on trying to find people that are non-judgmental and are just there to listen to you, and you being the same towards them, was there a part of you at some point that was very judgmental and that changed across time? Or how did you decrease the level of judgment that you have towards things and just stay open through the years?
Yeah, I think as like social beings, like social people, you start out your life without a lot of inhibition, right? Maybe you like dance a lot, you sing a lot as a kid, like you kind of like don't really care. Mm-hmm. And then I think like through those years of socialization of like going to school and like interacting with other kids and teachers, there's a lot that happens where you start to become very like self-aware of yourself, and then aware of like the group and others. And I think we inherently become very kind of like aware of status and are judgmental, whether we intend to or not, right? Like through those years of kind of like growing and maturity through
conditioning.
Yeah, through like high school. And so I think, for the most part, it wouldn't be surprising for me to hear if like most high school kids feel like, yeah, like there's like social class and there's like, these things that you're very hyper aware of. And I think we all probably carried that through into adulthood to some degree. But I think like the most enriching way and like beneficial way to live your life is to be thinking about like, how can I like separate maybe like the kind of like judgment and be more objective, and realize that there's so much that can be learned and gained through, frankly, just being like open to those around you in ways that you might not have otherwise have been if you had like the lens of judgment on. And as a result, I've seen that, I'd say, like through my 20s and 30s, where if I pass judgment, sometimes you realize you're like, wow, like that was, it was like poor of me to like think this way and preconceive something, and then learn so much from that person or that experience. And so I think like for myself, you start to learn through those experiences that objectivity and frankly just being open and willing to be a sounding board are beneficial, and it's like just a much more enjoyable way to live your life than over focusing on maybe other things.
Most definitely. What about traveling? How has travel opened that up for you?
So you and I have chatted a bit about traveling the world together, and my views are that it's probably some of the most enriching things that you can do at any stage of life, but especially early in life. And for myself, I had done a bit of traveling, mostly like family vacations and whatnot, when I was a boy growing up. I have a sister who's a couple of years younger than me, and my mom and dad would take us to various places on vacation. But it wasn't until late into my college life that I had kind of like a break in school where I had the opportunity to travel. And I have an aunt who is or was a professor of economics at the University of Toronto. And so she had really seeded in me that travel is like valuable and it's important to do and enjoy, especially when you're young and able. And she had really pushed me to go to travel to East Asia. So she had pushed me on either going to India back in kind of like the mid 2000s or China. And I ended up settling on China more out of just kind of convenience.
Settling is a great word for this one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just kidding. But okay. So speaking of travel, right? Like you're also an immigrant. You moved from Canada to the US. And you were on, it seems like a very different path in Canada. At least when you started college, you were sort of going into accounting, and then you moved to the US. You also did your startup in Canada, and then you moved to the US. So tell me about what are the differences you see in the Canadian, now that you're also in college in the US, the Canadian college system and the US college system. What would you say? Are there any similarities or differences in how these colleges are run?
You know, it's been so long, to be honest,
Yeah.
that when I think about the US college system and the Canadian college system, like the biggest standout to me, I would say, is the US college system has such an emphasis on collegiate sports. And if you look around like the University of Texas's campus and the number of stadiums and athletics, right? And like the whole university being centered around kind of like an athletic identity, that may not be true of every US college, but I feel like that's definitely like a common thread amongst a lot of the large kind of US institutions. And I'd say a lot of like, frankly, like the funding, right, through the US university system can be generated through collegiate sports. Whereas in Canada, the market for collegiate sports is just much smaller and different. So I think when I think about the differences in education, it's actually more in kind of like the student experience than it might be in the actual like academic learnings. And that's been fun because I'd say as a Canadian, I had thought about what my preconceived expectations of college were. And a lot of like what you consume in the kind of like Western world media would be the US college experience. And so the Canadian college experience being like a maybe like watered down version of that, especially in the collegiate sports world, was one experience that I had. And then I've always, thought that coming back to school at some point and just like at least experiencing it, would be kind of fun. And so you won't catch me at all the football games, but I hope to at least check out one of them.
Yeah, your son's also wearing the football jerseys already, so
yeah,
it's only time.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanna go more towards the altMBA experience first, because people have heard of Seth Godin, but I actually hadn't met anyone who's actually taken that course of his. So I'm very curious, like what led you to going to that program particularly, and what was the experience like?
So what led me, I would say, to that program in a way was like I had founded a travel startup, co-founded, I guess, and alongside a couple of friends of mine, and we had a ton of excitement about building up the business. And when we launched it, we ran a trip through South America, which was really fun and exciting. But we realized really quickly that trip and that experience didn't have the product market fit that it would need to be like a sustainable, durable business. And so we realized we would either need to like add more capital to it from our own savings or find outside money. And I think all of us realized pretty quickly that we weren't ready or in a position to continue it. And so there was a bit of like licking our wounds after that, because you feel like you failed, right?
Yeah.
And so I remember that feeling for me and thinking, what am I going to do next? I had previously worked in investment banking, which is like, I think a steady experience professionally. And if you can continue on that path, it seems like it'll take you at least like to good places from like an outside perspective. But I had left that to do the startup, and then to have the startup not go the way I wanted. I was thinking about ways to kind of like jumpstart myself, kind of like, again, intellectually and frankly from like a leadership and creativity perspective. And the altMBA at that time, I think it had maybe had a couple of cohorts go through it. It it was really focused on leadership and marketing and creativity. And so for me, it felt like a good way to maybe help shine a light and build skills in an area that I felt like was a blind spot on the other side of the startup experience I had, where I wished I was better at, frankly, like marketing and leadership. And so that's really what led me to the altMBA.
Okay, so let's go into the travel company experience, because that seems like a pretty big experience for you in terms of just learning a ton of things. So let's start off with, well, what was the travel startup? What was the problem that you saw when you guys started this? And then what did you kind of like see of why it wasn't viable?
Yeah, so this is all pre-COVID, kind of in the 2016, 17 era. And at that time, I had done just some travel with like friends and had started to really pick up that the world that I was living in Calgary, Alberta, working in finance and oil and gas companies, wasn't necessarily the same experience that people had in other places. And so people our age weren't of that kind of like experience set. And I think what I realized is that there was this big shift happening where through kind of like e-commerce and just like the growth of the internet, there were like greater factions of people that had jobs where, you know, they were knowledgeable people, like knowledge workers, and they had opportunities where they were working with companies remotely. And you could see this kind of like shift towards talent not having to be in the city where the company's headquarters was. Like talent, frankly, exists everywhere. And for small companies that are trying to compete, you know, they're looking to pick up talent any way they can. And so remote working, I guess, is like my vision or view of how that has like played out. And so when we were looking at, I guess on the other side of quitting our jobs and wanting to travel ourselves, the idea was like, well, could we build a company that could scratch our own itch and travel around the world and kind of like organize things in a way where if you didn't have a group of friends to go with you, you know, that you would basically be able to tap into that through this business that we founded. And so it was really targeted at people that had remote working jobs.
What were the people at that time that had remote working jobs? Like, what were the kind of professions you were seeing more so?
The most common ones I would say at that time were people that had e-commerce businesses, people that were working in, I would say like marketing functions or frankly, like, you know, the engineering, computer science, like data analytics. Like I would say at that time, a lot of those jobs, if you wanted, you could freelance. And even to this day, I mean, you can definitely freelance and or work remotely. And so those were like some of the common threads that we saw. And then obviously on the other side of COVID, everybody has effectively had a remote working job. So we were probably ahead of the times in terms of what our vision was. And frankly, like a business like ours, I don't think would have survived COVID because of how hard that was, where nobody could travel. You know, you're all kind of stuck in the place that you were from. But I think on the other side of it, it's like a neat idea that if you're young and able to travel, you could basically like tap into some sort of network that could take you places with like-minded people.
So do you know of a business right now that is doing that pretty well?
I do. I think so. Our idea, in a lot of ways, was inspired by a company called Remote Year. And Remote Year had done a really neat job of basically like putting kind of the concept into the world and drummed up a ton of interest, I would say. And so we saw that as like a good signal that, you know, I think they were very much like a first to market with this concept. And that if we could figure out how to fast follow with something, that could be compelling. And so that was like, I'd say like a company that inspired us. And ultimately that company, I think, still exists today and runs certain like travel programs throughout the world.
So, you know, let's dive a little bit more into your altMBA experience. So you've been, from what I understand, a participant of the program, but also a mentor.
I did, yeah. I actually did both.
So what was, if you just had to look back at that experience and think about the skills when it comes to leadership, you said leadership and creativity or what you were looking for in that, through that program, like what stands out to you? How have you applied that in your life?
Yeah, so I'd say as a participant in the altMBA program, a lot of the the work that we were done was to really like push you out of your comfort zone. And I'd say like if I was to try to summarize like one of the core kind of lessons in that, it was to ship it. The idea of like not sitting on top of your work until it's perfect. It's to like get a draft, put it out in the world and get feedback. And then to iterate off that feedback to kind of like grow your work into something that frankly you'll be proud of. And so as a participant, like one of the first challenges with shipping it is just like frankly like letting go of the things that are holding you back from kind of like basically submitting or sending it out into the world. So for me, like that was one of the biggest things was like as a banker or an accountant, professional services like train you to be so like diligent and in your accuracy and like kind of perfection. And so now all of a sudden you're shipping things that you don't feel like are ready and that's against your nature. And it takes a lot of, I'd say like practice, frankly, to like let go. So that was one of the biggest things that I experienced, I would say in the program was just learning to ship it.
Okay. And then on the mentor side, what, I'm personally very interested in what I call as near peer mentorship, which is, this model of, when we think of mentors, we think of like a sage that's just like there, like 20, 30 years older than you and just like giving you wisdom on like any question you ask. And with the world we're in right now, every few years, things are changing so rapidly that I believe the people that are 3 to 5 years ahead of you in whatever thing you're doing in life probably have a much better context of what you should do, that next step or two that you need, than someone who is 20 years, 30 years ahead of you. They have a different perspective to give and they can give, I think, a higher level view. But for someone that needs to take the next step in their life, this near peer is what I call, is I think much more important. So my question to you is more about mentorship and either you can tell me more about like who has been a mentor in your life that has been very impactful for you, and what does a good mentor-mentee relationship look like?
For one, I love the near peer label. I think that's good. And I think it's good for the reasons you shared, which is there can feel like a huge disconnect if you look at yourself versus somebody who's very like senior in a different season of their life that's many seasons ahead of you. And their advice sometimes, like you can just quickly know that like they won't have enough understanding of your lived experience to know what that next step is. They might be able to give you like a bit of a needle pointing on the compass. So that near peer concept I love. So your question was around thinking about like mentorship and like what's valuable and how to select a mentor?
Yeah, how does what is a good mentorship, like mentor-mentee relationship look like? How do you find, do you think there are certain ingredients that build a very good relationship when it comes to a mentorship?
So yeah, it's funny because like in a world of ChatGPT, right? You can go find these things on the internet and they're probably not at all bad pieces of advice in terms of like your mentor should be someone that you have trust with and transparency and that you can, we talked about sounding board things off of. Those are all good. And so for me, I think like taking all those and then thinking about it through like a much more human lens, which is like, if you go ask the internet a question, like you could certainly get a bunch of steps for like what a good mentor looks like. But to synthesize the human aspect of it, I think it's like really important that a mentorship is it's like fluid and comfortable. Because I think like if you're a mentor and you had someone who like was approaching you to like mentor them, if it's very like stiff and rigid, it becomes like a very uncomfortable experience, probably for both people. And so I think like finding mentorship in organic ways becomes like one of the most ideal setups. But it's also like, I think like what your podcast is all about is trying to help people find ways to be intentional. So it's like on the one hand, organic and just like having it happen to you is nice. But if you want to be very intentional, like how do you marry those things? And I think it becomes less about asking for mentorship directly and more finding it in your everyday. right? So like the kind of people that are friends or acquaintances of friends, or like within your 1 or 2 degrees, you may be able to engage in conversations with people where you start to realize this person has like a viewpoint that's interesting to you. And I think there are ways to cultivate those relationships into opportunities where you may be able to say, hey, like if I wanted to, like maybe you and I had this conversation, I said, I really enjoyed this. And would you be comfortable if I asked you a question sometime in the future? Like, is there a way that I can get a hold of you?
You have a story from your own life where you asked someone sort of organically these questions and they're mentors in your life?
I do, and it's funny because like now that I'm on the spot, it's like I'll probably just think of like recent ones.
Sure.
But there's like a family friend who is a professional engineer, and he's the chief operating officer at an oil and gas company. And he and I used to go for coffee when we were both, like when I was living back in Calgary. And we would just chat usually about like oil and gas or finance or life. You know, it was kind of like you'd start with a lot of work related things, and then it would expand.
Yeah.
And I think in that kind of like friendship, there was like de facto some mentorship because he was a few years older than I was, and I was like, I would say, kind of interested in the types of things that he was doing professionally. And so we were able to kind of like, if you think about like ping pong or tennis or something where you're rallying, right? Like I think a lot of times this conversation is a bit like that, where you're trying to figure out how to volley to one another in ways where it becomes fun, right? And one of the interesting things about this gentleman, Mo, was we had kind of lost touch when I had moved to go do my startup, and then when I ultimately landed in Austin. But I had reached out to him probably in the last month just to reconnect. And it was really neat because he was excited to hear from me. And, you know, he had like a good handful of things that he could share that were new and exciting in his life. And I had some as well. And so the reason I tell that story is because like, it's like, I think finding the ways to reconnect and frankly, like say, hey, like it's been a while since we last chatted. I really enjoyed our chats. It's a good time where I could give you a call.
Do you put this up on a calendar or something? Like, how do you remind yourself to keep in touch with people around you?
Yeah, there's probably better systems than what I have, which is more kind of like top of mind.
Okay.
Sometimes I'll use calendar reminders, which I think if you're being very intentional, right, that's effective. And then, you know, the more kind of like organic way is just thinking, you know, about those people that you care about, and maybe you have a list of like people you want to check in with, because I'd say like as you move through life, what I've experienced is like the older you get, kind of like the smaller your circle of people that you actually interact with becomes,
and probably care about.
Yeah, and like you'll know more people than you ever did, right? Just the virtue of kind of like accumulated, you know, friends and acquaintances. But I would say like the group gets smaller, especially like I would say later in your life. And so sometimes even having like that list, or just thinking about who are the kind of like core people that you want to keep in touch with, and like being intentional about that can be helpful. But at the same time, like what I've always felt has been the best experience both for me and I hope for others is that if you do fall out of touch with somebody, like being a good person that can just like be easy to pick things up with. I've always tried to be, I'd say like pretty easy and never holding, like, cause I would never want somebody to not reach back out if like they wanted to get in touch. And I've always tried to feel that way with others. So, does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, you sort of have now created in your mind, because there like a few people that you actually care about, and keeping them, like staying in touch with them consistently is something that you value the most. And then there's people that are outside in the concentric circles, and those, whenever they sort of come up, you sort of have but you act on that. That's the thing. A lot of times what happens for me, for example, is I have someone come to mind, and then I'm like, I should text them, and then I forget about it, and then a few days later I'm like, I should text them, and it just like, that's something that I've kept on doing, and it's a pattern I'm trying to break, is keeping like those relationships with people.
A couple of thoughts on that, because I would imagine like, well, for me, that like I can identify with that for sure. And like 2 ways that I've tried to get better at it is, one, if I think about that person that I wanted to like make a reconnection with or reach out to, I'll either like send the note now, or I might figure out the last conversation we had, especially digitally, and try to like unread it so that it sits visible to you. And then all of a sudden you can prompt yourself. Because a lot of times I feel like we think of these things in ways that are convenient for your mind to pick up, but like you might be driving. And so it's like, how do you leave yourself a reminder so that like 20 minutes or an hour from now you can remember? Or it might be before bed, where it's like maybe not the most ideal time to shoot somebody a note because they might think it's an emergency. So I think like finding those ways to set yourself a reminder, or just do it now, like don't wait till later, I think is always a good thing.
Interesting. You know, something that I struggle with there is when I think of someone, I really start thinking about what I should be saying to them. And like, I'll give you an example. There's a funny story. So I was trying to get this guy on a podcast. I've met him like maybe once or twice in my life. He's part of a VC in Austin, and very successful VC. Very, and I really enjoyed our conversation whenever we talked. Okay, I saw him on LinkedIn comment on someone else's post, and I literally just went ahead like that. That comment was about like, you know, the timelines of a startup are so off from what you think. And it was something like, you think that you're going to be pregnant in like 3 months, but then you actually will have a baby in like 10 months or something. Basically, like the timelines you set for yourself are so off in a startup that you should like account for that. I literally just like sent him a message because I saw him like that post, and I was like, hey man, knowing the world is pregnant, I want to try to get my baby out in 3 months, but it's been 6 months. And I was talking about my podcast here. And like, I'm always like over indexing on like, how can I be like funny or creative rather than just saying the damn thing, which is why I sometimes never say things to people, because I want to like for it to stand out in so many conversations.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like both those approaches can coexist.
Yeah.
And like having your own personal touch and like making things personal, like people ultimately love that, especially if they like know what you mean. If they're in on the joke, right? Like it's like fun to like get something where like, oh, like he saw what I saw and appreciated it. The flip side though, that I think about, where like I've tried to take some of the pressure off from like when you're trying to reconnect or like connect with people for the first time, is sometimes to actually err on the first part that you were maybe concerned about, which is like just like shipping it, right? And I think that the key maybe that you're trying to balance, that I totally appreciate, is striking a balance of not just saying like something discreet, like I want this and this is why I'm reaching out to you, but more about like that you were thinking about them. Because I think most people like to be thought of, and if you can contextualize like that in a way that they would respond positively to, I feel like that's like a pretty good way in terms of like how I want to receive it. So in the example you gave, it might be like, hey, I saw you like that post, and I was thinking about the podcast that I'm working on, and it's kind of like the baby that I want to have on this timeline versus that timeline. So that's my like just like reflecting on both, which is like if you were to sit with and agonize over finding the right joke, the risk is that you just get in your own head and you never actually ship the thing, and you miss out on the opportunity that like, you know, was very like important and tangible for you. Yeah. So
I want to ask you about your DoorDash side of things, because I think this connects a lot with sales and business development in some ways. So are there any examples of emails that you have been sent that you like remember because they were so different and they connected to some part of you? Someone like cold emailing you about something?
I feel bad that I'm gonna let like you and the listeners. I was like, I don't know that there's something that comes to mind where it's like so vivid and I remember exactly what it looks like. But
what about you? Have you sent something that you were really proud of? You're like, this is an amazing email.
So I keep actually on my like within my email inbox, and it's mostly stuff that I didn't write, but it'll be tags of emails that I thought really hit the mark on like whatever the message was. And so I'll do that, and whether I've gone back to look at those or not, it's just been like a nice comforting thing to know that like I appreciated that, and I was gonna like label it to have the opportunity to look at it later. I think some of the things that I think about where there was like common like themes is in a world where if you were to open up your personal email or something like that, right? At least for me, like there's so many things that you may have like signed up for at some point in time, and you just like there's a lot of noise, right? And a lot of that email traffic is very polished, right? Where like the subject line is very like intentional, and it's like it's got the right capitalization, or the email itself is like very it's like intends to be personal but in a very polished way. And like what I find is in a lot of cases, like you can see, right, that was like a mass mailer, and so it becomes very kind of like unengaging as opposed to engaging. So it actually ends up getting the opposite, I would say, like impact. And so what I found interesting is that if I wanted to get a hold of somebody, I would make sure the communication is professional, but I almost like err to the side of like, how can I make the subject line like just like a good catchy, like, hey, I'm writing to catch up on, and it doesn't have to be all caps. It doesn't have like do you know what I mean? Like you can make it almost conversational. And I would say the copy itself, like similarly, where you strike a balance of being professional and in that, you know, you're not riddled with spelling mistakes, but finding like a good conversational tone, I feel like goes way further, where the emails that I would respond to, or like whether it's LinkedIn or something like that, tend to be where somebody was just like a very like kind of like approachable person. And then I feel like that creates that kind of like social reciprocity where like, hey, this wasn't like some mass mailer. Like this person sat down and thought about something and sent it.
Exactly. So actually, let's dive into this because actually there's one more thing that you said earlier, which I found to be very important. And I think as we're going into this conversation to DoorDash, it'll come up as well. You sort of mentioned like how you were so used to in investment banking, like do this, your due diligence and just be overly structured in the way that you have to ship things, just release things, how you write them and all that. And you said it was almost an unlearning process where you had to kind of just like let it out, release stuff regardless of how you actually felt about it. You know, it had to be fine to a certain level, but it did not have to be perfect in your eyes. I recently heard this on a podcast and I was thinking about it. It was like, this guy was talking about working out and finding what are your limitations when you're working out, right? Like when you're running, sometimes people they stop running not because their muscles are tired, but because they just don't have the cardiovascular ability to keep on going. So there's like cardiovascular failure versus muscular failure. And so the limitation there is that your heart isn't strong enough to keep on pumping blood. Whereas in some other cases, it'll be the opposite, where like your muscles are not strong enough and they just like start hurting after a certain point of running. And then he said, basically what he said was, the place of adaptation is the place of limitation. So where you actually adapt in your life is where you feel the most limited.
Oh, that's good. Because I was actually even thinking about running in that I feel like for some people it's boredom, right? Because it's like you're either if you're on a treadmill, like that can get boring, or you know, out in public maybe you can go a little further, I feel like, but you might get bored of your route that you're running. And so in that case, like the limitation is frankly like boredom. But as you like sit with that, it's like pretty bang on, right? Where if you think about whatever your constraint is, that's the thing you're most likely, if you're going to try to free up and like find more, you know, optimize or whatever, it's like, well, you got to start with the constraints. And so I think that's right. I think like adapting in those areas of constraints are like the ways that you would practically approach it.
Sure. So you know, talking about your DoorDash experience, I actually have another surprise guest for you here.
Okay.
So I reached out to Chase Gardner. For people who don't know him, can you just give a little background who Chase was in DoorDash?
So Chase was like an early DoorDash person who led a lot of our like outside sales and then enterprise sales. And that's neat you reached out to him. He was like, I hold Chase in super high regard. He's kind of like one of the best storytellers, and like kind of like if you think about a narrative and wanting to be something that is like very kind of approachable and digestible, like Chase was awesome at telling the story.
What do you think he did really well there?
I think he took you on a journey. And so the ways that Chase would tell a story oftentimes started with like the founding of DoorDash and the founders and what their experience was and like why they went through, business school, focusing on like the problem of kind of like what ultimately was restaurants that had these orders that they just like had to turn down because they didn't have the logistics capabilities to basically like deliver them. And so Chase had done such a fantastic job of thinking through like that origin story and then weaving it into everything that we had done since. And it becomes really logical. We were like, oh, wow, like that makes a ton of sense. Like these founders were super focused on this problem and it led them here and then it led them here. And that narrative, I think, gets people engaged and also leaves you with the types of things you want them to be like feeling and left with as like memorable. So yeah, Chase is an amazing storyteller, amazing like business person that, yeah.
And he was kind enough to say these things. I asked him about you and just like, what was it like seeing Justin at that stage of his life? And he said, well, there's a few good stories. The most notable is the Torchy's taco deal.
Yeah.
Which took us years. And when we finally completed it, Justin and team went out to every location to train the staff and get comfortable for launch. So I'm curious to hear this story about Torchy's, first of all. And just like, what did it take at that stage for DoorDash to scale, to find these customers, to actually close these deals? Like, how was that environment like when you joined first?
Yeah. So in like 2017, 18, the industry for kind of like last mile logistics and third party marketplaces was like super nascent, right? So in a lot of ways there was lots of competition, but nobody had really cracked the nut on like the product market fit, the quality, like if you've ordered delivery right. The experience is pretty good now where like most of the time, like you can expect that it's going to show up on or before when the quote would be. But back in the day, it wasn't like that. So we did a pretty good job, but it was still like we were reaching to get 1% better. So I think about the experience for restaurants where at that time, you could see that there was this shift happening to like e-commerce and other parts of the economy that hadn't fully come to restaurants yet. And I would say for restaurants, they were open to the idea, but obviously like there's like concern around, hey, like if you're a restaurateur, you've built this brand, you want to make sure that if somebody else is engaging with that brand through another business like a DoorDash, that they're having a good experience. And so I would say for some businesses, they saw it as like an opportunity to jump on early and take advantage of a consumer cohort that was like super incremental because they were like coming to DoorDash or others hungry, and so whatever audience of merchants were there would get those sales. And really like the competition there was like probably the fridge, right? So your local grocery store or something like that, or doing nothing at all. And so anyways, I would say in those early days, you'd have different merchants on the adoption curve of like their willingness to maybe like in some ways feel like taking a risk and participate. And so in that example, it took a long time to build up the trust, which was super important. And
for anyone that doesn't know Torchy's Tacos, it's a pretty popular restaurant out here in Austin, but also outside of Austin, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's been a flagship in Austin for many years, and the founder Mike is like a fantastic person, fantastic like chef, and the tacos that Torchy's creates are like pretty much like nothing else you would ever have. There's such a neat like spin on Tex-Mex that's way beyond Tex-Mex.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's Indian versions of Torchy's tacos, and there's like chicken tikka something taco I've had before. It's like, it's amazing. It's awesome. But yeah, so what is that story like? Like, what was happening? Like Torchy's taco deal. Like, just take me back to that experience. Like, how did you guys go about that?
Yeah, I think through it, and it was really like chipping away at at being persistent in like a positive way towards like what their reservations were and like where we could help solve a problem for them. We felt pretty strongly, I would say, that there was demand for their restaurant on DoorDash, and so it was really about like finding a way to build trust to unlock that in like incremental steps. And so maybe to this story like Chase was telling, it was like, I'd say like once we had built the trust at the executive level, understandably they were very concerned that like they need to be able to have confidence that that same trust that they felt could be disseminated through to the restaurant GMs. And so a big part of where we put our like time and attention wasn't just say like getting them signed, for example. It was also making sure that all of the restaurateurs, the GMs had adequate training, that they knew who to call, that they understand the flow of how orders would come to them, and like when drivers would come to pick them up, and then like what would go wrong, right? Like who would they call? So a lot of that, I'd say, was pivotal in terms of building trust in order to get, I would say, kind of to the scale that you would achieve eventually if you did all those things right.
When the name of a company is a verb, the company has built a brand. So what do you think from the brand standpoint DoorDash did really well to build that brand?
Yeah, I think we started with just like the fundamentals and doing the little things right. And it's like kind of like an unremarkable thing to hear right from the outside in about anything that you feel like has like some sort of like remarkable current state. But I believe that's true, where like some of the biggest, most important things that we obsessed over were the things that went wrong, and like how could we correct those. And part of like the operating kind of like ethos, especially in the early days, was like, once a week at a minimum, we would sit down and talk about like a what would go wrong scenario. So like a disaster delivery.
Really?
And like excruciating detail. Like, so where did we fail? Where did things break down? And through that experience, you learn a ton, right? Which is like, oh gosh, like this is a gap that we need to fix. And I think about that experience, and if you compound that over, 52 weeks, a year later, you've solved for so many edge cases that aren't edge cases like as you scale, right? Because they become like 1 in a million can become quite common if you have millions of deliveries. And so, but by doing that and like focusing on those basics, you end up building a product that people like love and tell their friends about. And so I think focusing on those like little inputs and finding like the best like product market fit, the best quality, like knowing that customer expectations are always just going to get higher, can lead you down that path of, I would say, like building something special.
So I have a few more questions on DoorDash. One of the things that I came across was you basically were talking to Jake Butler, who was also part of DoorDash, and I saw this on LinkedIn, so I'm curious to just hear more about this part. It's like you were replying to something that he had said about how a lot of the things happen at the edges. A lot of these things, like the details of the strategy, it's good to be like on a higher level strategizing, but then you really have to understand the details of your business to find the little nuggets of insights and aha moments. And you sort of replied back to that saying, I recall the humble aha moment, learning this during my first few months at DoorDash. The average don't tell you much. The interesting data is at the edges, deep in the weeds. What, at that time, did you kind of like, do you have an example of like what you saw or noticed at these edges that really gave you some of these insights?
So yeah, I think about the professional experience that I had, and that that can lead you down a path of like if you're a consultant or a banker, like you're thinking a lot about comparables and averages, and so it's easy to get sucked into like how the various averages stack up and compare against one another. But when you're in an operating environment, the averages don't really mean or tell you much at all. It's because the obvious math is like they're the collection of all the things beneath it, right? And so if you blend all that together and try to take an average at face value, like you won't be able to make a ton of like interesting and meaningful decisions. And that's actually like kind of like hard to grasp in some ways, maybe counterintuitive, that the average, the thing that you just took all the effort to like calculate, doesn't mean anything, right? Fundamentally, it's like, wait, so then why did I do it? But I think like the point there is that the edges, right, high or low, those extremes can tell you something about what's going on in a business that is like super insightful, which is like, you know, how did we, you know, do this so poorly? What was broken? Or like, how did this go so well? And a lot of times what you can learn is that through those edges, that there's like so much more possible if you can decode what happened there to like leverage those as insights and improvements. And so I remember kind of the early time at DoorDash, I had to kind of like go through that retraining of yourself where it's like the averages are kind of like misleading. And if you focus there, like you'll never make high quality decisions. But as soon as you start getting into the edges, you'll find all kinds of certain, you know, unique examples of what's possible or like what can go drastically wrong. And when you fix those, right, you can start to really migrate the overall performance in like the direction you want it to go. So Jake's comment there, I thought was like spot on, like thinking back to those experiences. And so it was kind of like a time capsule moment when I saw that, and I thought I'd share with him.
Very interesting. So since then and now, what have you seen? How have you seen DoorDash's culture change? What has remained the same and what has changed?
I think one of the things that has impressed me most has been that the company values that we have are lived, I would say, like especially in the early days, like when we would have all hands meetings, leaders at the company, from the CEO and the founders down to management, all really took time to celebrate the things that had happened during that business cycle that fed back into the values that you would see and learn, say, like on your first day or week. And this isn't to take like shots at other companies, but it's like a lot of times those things can like be on a wall or like be part of like an introduction, but they're maybe not like lived or like reiterated. And so what I found very unique and kind of like special is that it was constantly reinforced through these types of like all hands meetings, like the things that we had done as a company that really like embodied the values. And so the reason I think that's important is because I do think that those values become like the operating system and what you do, you know, when no one's looking or something, right? It's like super important that that we're all autonomous and like go out and do the right things. And like the way that I think you guide those is through values. So I think what's impressed me is that is as we've grown, we continue, at least I believe, like continue to see the same level of celebrating and reinforcing like the values that I believe are like core to the kind of like operating system of success. So yeah, that to me is like one of the things that like is still so remarkable. It's like the DNA that way hasn't changed. And then I would say like as you move through the arc of being a startup that's like looking for product market fit, that's looking to kind of like establish traction, you inherently can take a ton of risks, right? Because you don't actually necessarily know in some cases like what's working and what isn't. You're finding that out iteratively.
There's nothing to lose.
You have nothing to lose because you don't actually know what the customer wants or like how to solve for some of those problems. You're like testing and experimenting to learn. As you become bigger, you start to learn like what is working, and you can start to establish like better processes around that. And so, I mean, just like any company, like I'd say like we've certainly done a lot to really like hone in on how can we get better at and like leverage better process. And so in some cases that from like startup experience, it can feel like more, I don't know, like bureaucratic or administrative. But I think when you're actually running a business at scale, you have to live both experiences to be successful. You have to like figure out like how to scale the things that are working and constantly find like the 1% betters as well as like the 10x. The 10x though isn't going to be found by doing things the way you did before. So you're having to like live also back in the startup kind of like mentality of like, how can I take risks that are acceptable and like help me learn. So you have to kind of like live both, I think, if you're going to be successful both at scale, but also if you're trying to like build a new thing.
So, speaking of that, I feel like the level that a company grows caps at the level that a leader is growing within the company. So it's really just about pushing. The people that have started the company have to keep on unlearning, learning, relearning, growing themselves, because then at some point they will become the constraint of the business. How do you went from probably starting out as an employee in the business development team, and then you probably now have a team, right, of people. How have you had to change your own skills from being maybe like a individual contributor to now leading a team?
I think, yeah, for me, I've gone through kind of like arcs that have pulsed, where like at certain points of time I've had one direct report, other times I've had maybe it's like a dozen of reports, and so I would say it's like being a leader, especially of like larger teams, it becomes so critical to I guess like be very clear about like expectations and the mission, so that like people know, right, like what we're focused on and what success looks like. When it's a smaller team or you're an individual contributor, like you look to whatever the dissemination of that information is to you, and usually if you don't understand, you can just like say, hey, like I want to clarify, like is this what we're doing or is it that? But with larger teams, it becomes more important to be super clear, I would say, about what you're working on, and that I think is a learned skill. So so like as a manager, you want to make sure that as you start to like expand your scope beyond say like IC to management, that you're thinking about those things, which is like now you're responsible for making sure that others are enabled and empowered to do their work, but they also know what they're working towards and for. So that's probably one of the things that as you transition from like an IC to management becomes so clear, is like making sure that you understand as the manager like what everybody needs to be working towards, and you can communicate that efficiently and effectively. And then the other pieces I think are really around I think good managers at the core are people that are helping their teams kind of like be unblocked by the things that get in the way. And for those that are new to management, if you can figure out how to do that, you're usually going to be looked at, I'd say, through like favorable eyes of the people that work with you.
It seems like the common theme and common takeaway from this conversation is that you have to look at the constraints of either your own faults as a person and figure out how you can like better them, be it judgment, be it whatever it might be it overthinking how you are perceived to people, be it reaching out to someone. You have to go beyond your limitations in some ways to adapt and find the constraints and solve for them. And that's sort of like what makes a leader. When the leader is doing that for people, they're a really good leader. When the people are doing that for the company's problems, they're a good employee. And so it's really about like figuring out the limitations and kind of breaking them one by one. That's kind of like a major takeaway from this conversation that I've had, because you've talked about in your own journey how you had to do that multiple times, and even within DoorDash you've had to do that, and so has everyone else at DoorDash.
Yeah, I think like that experience and thinking about that framework, like certainly valuable at work, right? Like finding the constraints and adapting, great professionally, but even like in your personal life, like if I think about how to be a better husband or father or son, it's like a lot of times if you can think about how to adapt, right? Like the way you're interacting with your family, your spouse, or your kids, like those can be opportunities, right? Where it doesn't always have to be so tactical, but ultimately, like if you can add value and like think about ways to help your wife have a better day, or your kids, by thinking about them through the lens of like what might be a nice gesture, right? There's just funny ways to connect it, I'd say, in personal life. So very applicable, I'd say, like in the professional world. But there's other ways I even like sometimes think about it through the personal sort of like lens as well. So
100%. Dude, I feel like we literally went through maybe 60% of the questions we had.
Yeah.
So we got to run this back again. And this one's going to be more about how you had to balance your family and career life. I think that would be an interesting question to ask you. And it's something that a lot of people, even in our class at UT Austin, are thinking about. But dude, thank you so much for joining in. This was a blast. And I have definitely learned about you way more than I had before. And just the way that your journey has kind of taken you to where you are now. So thank you so much.
Sardak, this was great. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome.